Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm just here to film a really quick introduction because today's video is going to be my palette collection and declutter video. My goal is to try and declutter 30 eyeshadow palettes in today's collection declutter video. It's really more of just a collection, but I also wanted to just take the time to declutter a few palettes while I was at it. A few palettes that I have in my collection that I just don't feel like I need, because I want to bring my collection, my palette collection, down to like a slightly more manageable, I put those in very loose air quotes, a slightly more manageable size. But if I did my calculations correctly, I believe I have 162 eyeshadow palettes currently in my collection. So I really just wanted to bring it down under like 130. That was the goal. But if you guys are interested in seeing all of the eyeshadow palettes that I currently have in my collection, as well as a few that I will be getting rid of, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I would love if you would consider subscribing before moving on. We are currently in the midst of palette week, so every single day for the last few days we have just focused on palette themed content, and I have a few more videos the next couple of days as well, so don't forget to subscribe before moving on. And other than that, let's get into this collection and declutter video. I really hope I'm not forgetting anything. I would not put it past me to be forgetting a palette or two. So if you guys know my collection really well and you're like, hey, wait, what about that palette? Please forgive me. These are all of my like smaller-ish palettes. I have a lot of my little Huda palettes, Natasha Denona minis, etc. A lot of my quads. We'll briefly go through these, and I'm already seeing a few here that I feel like I can declutter. So let's get started. So first I have 4 of the Pat McGrath quads. I love the Pat McGrath quads. I think they're really fun. I don't see myself parting with any of these. This one is Eternal Eden. This is the only one I would potentially consider decluttering, just because this is probably like the least special to me out of all of them, but I do love these 2 shades, so I would actually like to hang on to this, but I'm going to set this one aside in the maybe pile, because if we're close to decluttering 30 things but not quite there, then this is something that I will potentially consider decluttering. Then I have Fleur Fantasia, which I think is a really beautiful one. Again, I really enjoy these 2 shades. These 2 I could really do without, and to be honest, oh, I'm gonna hang on to this one. Next up I have Interstellar Icon. I love this one. I think that this one is so beautiful. I love the curation of colors here. I think it's a really beautiful color story. This might be, I think, possibly my favorite quad from Pat McGrath, so definitely keeping this. And then newest to my collection, I have the Voyeuristic Vixen, which is so beautiful. I'm so excited to play around with this one for the fall time. I should have pulled this into my fall palette rotation, but I definitely plan to do that for my next Shop My Stash. Next up, we can jump into my little quads by Makeup by Mario. So up first, I have the Bronzy Glam palette, which I really enjoy. I think this is just a really fun, easy to use palette, really nice for a complimentary palette as well. I think the quality is good, and I will be keeping this, but I am going to be decluttering my Rosy Glam palette. I talked to you guys in my palette roulette series about how I planned to declutter this palette. I'm just not as in love with this one in terms of color story. I don't find myself excited to reach for this, and I just don't feel like there's any reason for me to keep this in my collection. I almost forgot to grab my Nars Climax palette because it was sitting in the palettes I'm testing, but we can quickly go through my 2 Nars palettes. I will be keeping both of these. This one is the newest one to my collection. This is the Climax palette. Like I said, I just wanted to make sure I had that correct. This is really beautiful. I don't absolutely love the way that the mattes perform in this, but I love the shimmers in this, so definitely keeping this. And then this was like my staple go-to palette this summer. This is the Nars Summer Solstice palette, and I think that this one is so beautiful, so definitely keeping this as well. Next up, I have the Oma Beauty Coming to America palette. I have the colorful one, which I haven't even finished testing out for review on my channel, so I'm definitely keeping this. And then I also have my Sugar Pill Mini or Fun Size palette, which you guys know I love this palette. I was super into this last year, and I haven't reached for it as much this year, but I still love this palette, and I will definitely be holding on to this. The Nubian Mini by Juvia's Place, I just included in my palettes on their last hurrah palette, which is essentially turned into a chopping block video on my channel, but I actually think I'm just going to declutter this palette. I just feel like I don't need this. I have these tones throughout my collection and I feel like it's just kind of taking up space, and if I reach for this, there's something else I'd probably rather be reaching for, so I am going to be decluttering this one. I will be keeping this one from Viseart. This is the palette that I decided to test Viseart again with. This is the La Plague palette. This was so beautiful for the summertime as well. I'm really happy that I decided to give Viseart another try because I was just super impressed with this palette, and I'm very happy to have this in my collection. So I will definitely be keeping this. Next up, we have my two Charlotte Tilbury quads. So up first, I have the Exaggerized quad, which I will be keeping. I think this is nice, especially just for like an easy everyday on the go sort of palette to use. I don't necessarily think it's worth the $53, but I am going to keep this. And then we have the palette of Pops, which is currently going in my Pan and Every palette project. However, I think I'm going to declutter this. I really do. I just am not that inspired to reach for this. And I just feel like I'm like kind of forcing myself to use this, and I feel like it would just be so much better in a home with someone who would appreciate this formula more. So I am going to declutter my Charlotte Tilbury palette of Pops palette. I will be keeping all of my Natasha Denona little minis. I have the mini gold, the mini glam, the mini love, the mini nude, as well as the mini retro. You guys know I love my Natasha Denona mini palettes. I could not part with these. I will also be keeping both of my Rowan quads. I have the 1111, which is such a beautiful arrangement of shades. And then I also have the 75 degrees, which I've actually been using a ton this year. This has gotten a ton of use. I love the Rowan quads. I get that they're not for everybody, but I personally am a huge fan, and I will be keeping both of mine. I'm also going to be keeping my Tom Ford quad. It's not my favorite color story, but the formula is really nice. I paid $88 for this, and I do want to continue to get some use out of this. I will also be keeping my Aether Beauty quad in Amreteen. I love this. I think it's such a good quad. I know this was on sale at Sephora, and I would say if it's still half off, I would highly, highly, highly recommend this palette. I think that the quality is phenomenal. This shade is so foiled and metallic and beautiful. I just really enjoy this. And then I also have this little 6-pan palette that I can't even remember where I got this or how this came into my life. I've only used it a couple of times, but it's actually really good quality. The mattes are really nice and the shimmers are really foiled and intense. So I do want to keep this one as well. All right, let's start talking about my Huda Beauty 9-pan palette collection. The neon orange palette I will be keeping. This is just so unique to my collection, and I really enjoy reaching for this every summer. And then I feel like it may come as no surprise, I actually am going to declutter both my Khaki Haze and Sand Haze palette. I recently talked about these in palettes that I would declutter if I could get my money back. And even though I can't get my money back, I just do not feel inclined or inspired to reach for either of these. In fact, they kind of just like make me mad to reach for, just because I felt like I was so let down and disappointed by these two. So I actually will be decluttering both of these. And then I'm kind of surprising myself with this, but I actually think I'm also going to declutter my chocolate brown palette from Huda. This is one that I just feel like I have these shades in my collection, and I wasn't uber impressed with the formula. I much prefer my Huda Nude Medium as well as my Huda Nude Rich. I'm even interested in picking up the Nude Light, but I just don't feel like I'm going to get a ton of use out of this, and I feel like I can get the same sort of effect by reaching into my Huda Naughty Nude, which I really enjoy. So I actually will also be getting rid of the Huda Chocolate Brown palette. That being said, I am going to be keeping the rest of my Huda palettes. So from the original line, I have the Gemstone palette, which I actually really enjoy. This is still going in my palettes on their last hurrah, and I had originally planned to declutter this at the end of 2021, but I don't see myself doing that now. I also have Smoky Obsessions, which you guys know has been a long time favorite for me, as well as Coral Obsessions, which is just such a nostalgic palette for me because I take this with me on just about every trip I've ever taken. So it just has really fond memories and just makes me happy to open this and look at. Also, the newest ones to my line, I have the Wild Tiger palette, which I love. I also have the Python palette, which is beautiful, and then the Jaguar palette, which is a really beautiful cool toned palette, and I've been really impressed with these. I recently reviewed these in a ranking video. Not the most most recent month, but the month before that. So keep an eye out for, so if you're interested in seeing more thoughts on these three, I'll leave that video linked down below for you guys. And then the final two from Huda that I have, like I mentioned, I have the Nude Medium, which I love, as well as the Nude Rich. I think that both of these are beautiful. Love the quality on both of these and will definitely be keeping. I will be keeping all of my Colourpop quads. I have Creamsicle, and then I have a bunch from the new Zodiac collection as well. I have the Libra. This is not from the Zodiac collection. This is Sorbet. And then this is one of the original quads in Sparkler. Then I also have the Taurus, the Virgo, the Capricorn, the Pisces. Yes, Pisces, as well as the Cancer. So, and then that again is, I hope I was just in frame for all that. This is the Sparkler one again, or Creamsicle one again, but I will be keeping all of my Colourpop quads. Looking at it in front of me, I see not a whole heck of a lot more that I'm going to be getting rid of. From Odin's Eye, I have a couple of their like 6-pan palettes. So I have the Verdandi, as well as the Elva Mini Forest palette. I love both of these. I love Odin's Eye, so very happy to keep these. We can quickly go through my Kaleido 6-pan palettes as well. I have Sashimi City, will be keeping. Lunar Lavender, which I will also be keeping. As well as Astro Pink, which, you guessed it, I will also be keeping. I love the Kaleidos formula. I will also be keeping all of my Nabla Cutie palettes. I have the Midnight palette, which is a beautiful blue palette. I also have the Analog palette. I have the Wildberry palette, the Metropolitan palette, the Nude palette, as well as the Platinum palette. You guys know, I just love Nabla so much. Definitely will not be getting rid of any of these. Okay, so then I have Juvia's The Pinks palette, which is not my favorite, but for fun pink looks, I don't really want to declutter this, so I'm going to keep this. And then I also have the Mauves, which is this really beautiful mauve tone palette, which I think I'll get a ton of use out of in the winter, so I will be keeping this as well. Lawless, the baby one, is going nowhere. This is one of my favorite mauve palettes in my entire collection, and I'm also going to be keeping this 7-pan palette from Marc Jacobs. This was the Electric palette, and I love this one. And then finally from this bundle, I have the Dose of Colors 5-pan palettes. I will be keeping my Baked Browns. I do love this palette, and I get a lot of use out of that. I also have Sassy Siennas, which I will be keeping. I do love this in the springtime, but I will be decluttering, and I've talked about this on my channel already, that I will be decluttering Marvelous Mauves. I just don't get enough use out of this, and I don't feel super inspired to reach for this one, so I'm going to be decluttering this one. Okay, so out of my mini bunch, we have 7 for sure. Yes, we're decluttering palettes. We have the Marvelous Mauves, the Sand Haze, Khaki Haze, Chocolate Brown, Palette of Pops by Charlotte Tilbury, Nubian by Juvia's, as well as my Mario Rosy Glam. So 7, that means we have 23 palettes that we need to declutter from my regular size palettes. Okay, here's my pile of all the rest of my palettes. I honestly do not feel like sorting these all out and laying them all really nicely. I hope you guys don't hate me for that, but I'm literally just gonna grab from the pile and talk through each one. Please don't hate me for that. Is that annoying? Is that annoying? I'm gonna try and go in order of brand. I will do that. I will try and go in order of brand. So from Juvia's Place, the other 2 larger Juvia's palettes that I have the Nomad palette, which I will definitely be keeping. I love this color story. I think it's so much fun for the fall. And then the Magic palette by Juvia's Place, I just included in my palettes on their last 2 raw. If I don't use this 10 more times by the end of the year, then I will be decluttering this. But for right now, I am going to be keeping this palette. All right, next up from Sigma, I have 4 of their eyeshadow palettes. I have the Untamed palette, which I think is such a fun grungy palette for the fall time, so I will definitely be keeping this. I also have the Sigma Warm Neutrals palette, which looks like this and is actually a really beautiful palette, but I do think I'm going to pass this on just because I don't feel super inspired to reach for this, and I have all of these shades throughout my collection in other palettes, so I am going to be decluttering the Sigma Warm Neutrals. I also have Sigma Enchanted, which I think is such a beautiful, almost like fairy-esque sort of palette, but you can still go deep with the deep mattes on the end. So I will be keeping that. And then I think my favorite from Sigma that I own is the Corderosa palette, which I think is such a beautiful one for the summertime. So I will be keeping this. I do have 3 palettes from Lunar Beauty, all of which I will be keeping. I have the Lunar Eclipse palette. This palette is such a beautiful one. I also have the Greek Goddess palette, which I think it has been discontinued, but I think this one has been discontinued, but I actually really love this one. I think it has such a beautiful color story. Again, really nice, like grungy fall tones, and I'm a huge fan of this one. And then finally, I have the Moonspell palette, which I still have yet to use and review on my channel. I really need to get around to this one. I love the grungy tones in this, but I also love that you still have a row of neutrals in case you are intimidated by some of the color in this palette. I think it's such a beautifully packaged palette as well, just so fun, and I will definitely be keeping this. I do have 2 palettes from Alter Ego, both of which I will be keeping. I have the Canyon palette, which is this one right here, which is supposed to be a dupe for the Natasha Denona bronze palette. Such a beautiful palette. And then I also have the Alter Ego Artemis palette, which looks like this, supposed to be a dupe for the Metropolis palette from Natasha Denona, and I also love this palette. The shimmers in here are just so beautiful, and I will definitely be keeping this. Okay, the only large Dose of Colors palette that I have is the Friendcation palette, which I will be keeping. Such a beautiful palette. I also just have one large Aether Beauty palette, which I still have yet to review and test out on my channel. So this one I will also be keeping. From Nomad Cosmetics, I have the Land and Ice. I have this palette right here. This is not my absolute favorite. I didn't think the quality of the shimmers was that good. Definitely need to be used with a glitter glue if you want to get longevity. I still think that the color story in this is really unique and fun, and I am still interested in some other Nomad palettes because I just think they have such good color stories. I can't remember the other one that I have my eye on, and then they just released another one that looks so beautiful, but you guys will have to let me know if you've tried Nomad Cosmetics and what your favorite palettes are, but I will be keeping this one. Okay, I think this is my only palette currently by e.l.f. This is the Electric Mood palette, and while I liked this palette, I thought that it was okay. The quality was okay. The mattes were fine. There are definitely some dud shades in here. There's also some really beautiful shimmer and metallic shades in here as well, but I just feel like using this, like if I use this, I would rather be using a different palette. I don't feel like this is something that really sparks a ton of joy for me when I use it. So I didn't think I was going to declutter this one, but just thinking about having a goal of 30, I don't feel like I'll miss this in my collection. So I am going to declutter this palette. And then actually another palette that I know I'll be decluttering is the Zoeva Cocoa Blend palette. This is just older in my collection. It's not a favorite. I didn't think the quality was great. The mattes were fine, but I felt like the shimmers or the metallic shades were just super lackluster, and I never ever get excited to reach for this palette, so I will be decluttering this. I just realized that my nails are like, should have painted them for a declutter video, but oh well. I'm also going to declutter my Violet Voss All of You Forever palette. I have tried, I think, 3 Violet Voss palettes up till this point, and I've just not been impressed with any of them. So this is something where I do enjoy actually the metallic shades, but I do not think that the mattes perform well at all, and I'm not interested in keeping this in my collection. So I'll be decluttering this. I believe this is the last palette I have left from Dominique Cosmetics. This is the Latte palette, and I will be keeping this. I do enjoy this palette. I think it's a really nice staple basic palette to have in my collection. I do like the quality on this one, and this one will be a keep. My only palette thus far from Be Perfect is the Carnival 3. I'm really interested in the new, like, really grungy fall tone one that they released. but haven't picked that up yet. I don't think I've reviewed this on my channel yet just because it's taken me a really long time to try and get through every shade to test out, but I actually have been really impressed with this one so far. I don't love large eyeshadow palettes like this, but I think that this is such a fun color story, and I'm really happy to have this one in my collection, so I'll definitely be keeping this. From Alamar Cosmetics, this is the only Alamar palette I currently have in my collection, and I've been going back and forth on this one because I don't ever feel inspired to reach for this, but I do really like these shimmer shades in this palette. So I think what I've decided to do is I'm going to declutter this palette, but I am going to try and depot these 4 shades and stick them in a Z palette. But keeping this palette in total just does not make sense to me. I can't remember the last time I actually reached for this palette, and I honestly think these shades would get more use if they had been depotted and were just used as single shades, so I will be decluttering this palette. From Alien Cosmetics, I recently got their Not Normal palette, which looks like this. I think this is such a beautiful and stunning palette. I love the color story. I think the quality is really good, and I've been having so much fun with this one. It is newer to my collection. I will definitely be keeping this. My sister just gifted me these two, so I will be keeping, but I have not tried these yet. I have the Lime Crime Venus 3, as well as this one from Illamasqua. I've never tried Illamasqua Shadows before. Here is that one. I don't know if I was out of frame for the Lime Crime one. There is the Lime Crime Venus 3. I haven't tested either of these yet, so I will obviously be keeping both of these. From Sydney Grace, this is the only Sydney Grace palette that I have, and I will be keeping this. This is the Tiny Marvels palette. I love this palette in collaboration with Mel Thompson. Such a beautiful, beautiful color story and really great quality, so we'll definitely be keeping this. I think this is my only palette from Catrice. It's the Insta Bay eyeshadow palette, and while the quality on this is pretty good, especially considering that this is a drugstore palette, I just don't feel excited to reach for this one, so I will declutter this. Okay, I'm gonna jump into these two from Tarte. I do still have the one more. Oh, there it is. Okay, I have 3 Tarte eyeshadow palettes. I will be keeping this one for sure. This is the Love, Trust, and Fairy Dust palette. I actually do really enjoy this. This is in my palettes on their last hurrah. I'm trying to decide if I want to declutter this or if I want to keep this one by the end of the year. Mine's just getting really gross in that there's a lot of chipped shades, broken shades. I obviously do love this palette though because I have a couple of pans. It will be hard to give up these 2 shimmers, and I'm actually really excited to use these mauves this fall, winter, so this one will be staying. I am going to be getting rid of the Tartiste Pro palette. I think I got this in a BoxyCharm like last year, and I maybe used it 1 or 2 times, but I'm just not inspired at all by this palette, and I have not used it and see no reason to keep this around. And then I will also be keeping my Tarte Young, Wild, and Cruelty Free. This is the Unleashed palette, which released, I think, 2 summers ago. I think this is a really beautiful, really fun palette. I love the mauve toned row at the top, and I will be keeping this, like I said. All right, these are my Too Faced palettes. I will be keeping my Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette. I love this palette. This has gotten a ton of use out of me this year and will continue to get use. I think this is such a practical palette, so we'll be keeping that, as well as my Pumpkin Spice palette. I love this palette. Very excited to have this in my collection, and obviously we'll keep this. I'm going to put the Too Faced Palm Springs Dream palette in my maybe pile. I would like to keep this, but I'm kind of on the fence on this one, so if I'm not quite to that 30 mark and I'm close enough, this is something I could consider. I could see myself considering decluttering, but we'll see about that. And then I also will declutter my Too Faced Natural Matte Palette. This is another one I got in BoxyCharm last year and just really have not reached for. I think I reached for this 1 time for this shade right here. And then I was like, no, like, it's a pretty palette, but I just don't feel like I need this, so I'm gonna get rid of it. Let's jump into my ABH palettes, because I feel like this might be a little bit shocking. So my ABH Soft Glam palette, which was a favorite palette of mine for so long, I went into this thinking I was going to declutter it, and then I open it up and I'm like, I don't know, but I do have my Nabla Side by Side, which is really, really similar, and I have not been excited to reach for this palette this much this year. I cannot decide. Why am I struggling? I'm going to put this in the maybe pile. Okay, we're going to put Soft Glam in the maybe pile because I just can't decide. My Norvina palette, I am definitely going to be keeping. This is on my palettes on their last 2 raw, but I've actually really enjoyed this palette. Makeup by Mario ABH is also in my palettes on their last 2 raw, and I will not be decluttering this one right now. We'll also not be decluttering ABH Jackie. This is my favorite ABH palette. Also a favorite ABH palette is my Sultry palette. Also will not be decluttering. Subculture and Modern Ren, however, I am ready to part with. I am ready to finally do it and say goodbye to my ABH Modern Renaissance as well as my Subculture. I'm just not excited to reach for these ones anymore. So I also have my ABH Amreezy palette, which I will not be getting rid of. I actually really do enjoy this palette, even though I do not reach for it enough. I need to pull this out onto like where I get ready so that I can remember to reach for this guy, but this one will be staying in my collection. This is my only palette from KKW, and even if I don't really love this palette as much as I thought I would. I think the mattes are just subpar quality, but I'm going to keep this one anyway because I love the packaging and I actually really do like some of the shimmers in here. So this one will be staying. It's also newer to my collection. Menagerie Pastel Pup will be staying in my collection. This is such a great pastel palette and I love to have like indie palettes in my collection, especially good quality ones. So this one will be staying. I have 3 BH Cosmetics palettes currently in my collection. I have the Lunar New Year, which I honestly feel like I could declutter, although this just recently rolled into my palette roulette. So if I don't like it as I use it consistently the next month, then maybe I will declutter this one. But for right now, this one's gonna stay. My BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival palette is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, so I definitely will not be getting rid of this. And then newer to my collection this year, I have the 90s Remix Dance palette, which is really great quality, a really good palette, and I will be keeping this one in my collection as well. Here are the rest of my Kaleidos palettes. I do have the Escape Pod, which I love and will be keeping. I also have the Club Nebula palette, which I also love and will be keeping. And the Flower Punk palette, another really great palette, really beautiful, grungy, and fun color story. So definitely will be keeping this. Okay, let's jump into my Melt palette collection. First up, I have She's in Parties, which I have not yet used, reviewed, or tested for my channel. I'm gonna keep this. I also have Melt Smoke Sessions, which I've really come to love. And I love green eyeshadow, so I definitely will not be parting with this. Melt Rust, I love, will be keeping. Melt Mary Jane, the quality on this is not great, specifically with some of the shimmers. They're just like more chunky, almost like glitter, and you get a ton of fallout, but I still do really enjoy this palette, and I am going to keep this. I'm also going to be keeping my Melt Gemini palette. I love this palette, such a beautiful grungy palette. And then finally I have this one. This is the Melt Vita palette that everybody lusts after, and I was so excited to get my hands on this, but I've only used this one time and it's just really not a color story I see myself really using at all. So because I know there's so many people who want this palette, I think I am just going to actually sell this one because I'm sure somebody else would get just so much more use out of it than I am. So I am going to, even though I love the artwork on this, but am I really just going to keep this around for the artwork? I should really just declutter this. So this is a really tough choice because I remember like how excited I was that I finally got my hands on this, but I just have not reached for this. The collector in me like really wants to keep this, but I also don't have the Muerte palette. So, I'm gonna declutter this. Okay, let's start going through some of my Colourpop palettes because I have a lot. So going Coconuts, I know we all know this palette. I am gonna be keeping this, just such a staple to have in the collection. I'm also going to keep the Mandalorian palette, such a fun green color story and such just a cute palette in general. Also the On Cloud Blue I'm gonna keep just for like if I want. These are just, it's a good compiling of blue shades if I want to have fun with blues. So I will keep that. Also will be keeping the Limoncello palette. This is one of my favorite Colourpop palettes in my collection. So I will be keeping this. And then I also have the Sweet Talk palette, which is newer to my collection. And I didn't think I was going to declutter this, but now I'm like, I don't know. Should I? No, I'm going to keep this for right now. I'm going to keep this one for now. Next up, we have Lil Ray of Sunshine, which I love and will be keeping. I also have the Taupe palette, which is not like my absolute favorite in terms of Colourpop's quality, but I do really like the color story on this, especially for days that I want more of a cool toned look. So I will keep that. I am going to declutter my Baby Got Peach palette. I am ready to let this guy go. I think I might depot like this shade and this shade, but aside from that, I have used the heck out of this palette. It's gotten so much love in its lifetime, and I'm just ready to declutter this. I'm also going to be decluttering the She's Got Solstice palette. I think I might pop out this shade, which is my favorite shade, and possibly this green shade, but aside from that, I just think this is kind of a boring palette, and I don't need to keep this in my collection. The Cabana Club is newer to my collection, and I really enjoy this palette, so I will definitely be keeping this. And then the Hello Kitty and Friends palette. I have mine in the box because I do plan to declutter this. I just don't love this color story. I don't find it that interesting. I don't find it that fun. And I just never feel like reaching for this. So I'm going to declutter that. And then the Dream Street palette I'm decluttering, but I've already popped out all of the shades that I want, which is all but 2 of the shades. But this is a declutter, if you will. I still have more Colourpop, so I have the Tinkerbell palette, which is the newest to my collection. This is okay. I like the shimmers. I don't think the quality of the mattes is that great, but I will be keeping this. I am going to be decluttering the Cloud Spun palette. Mine is kind of broken, and I again might pop out a couple of these shades, but I just do not feel inspired by this palette, and I honestly think my daughter would have so much fun with this, so I'm going to declutter that. My Colourpop Barbie palette I've already donated to my daughter's salon, if you will. So I am going to be officially decluttering the Colourpop Malibu Barbie palette. This was okay. I felt like the shimmer quality on this was not great. The matte quality on this was good, but I have these shades in my collection, and I just wasn't as excited for this palette when I got it and saw it in person as I was when I saw it online. So this will be a declutter. How did the Sweet Top, oh, whoops, then the rest of these I've already talked about, whoopsies. All right, just a few more Colourpop palettes. I have the Colourpop Lush Life palette, which I really enjoyed and will be keeping. I have the Making Mauves palette, which I will also be keeping, and just a really beautiful mauve tone palette. This is such a staple. And then I also have the Stone Cold Fox palette, which has not gotten enough love from me, but I am gonna be keeping this because I think it's a really good staple, just basic, cool tone, or even like neutral palette to have in my collection. I will be keeping all 3 of my Urban Decay palettes. I have Stoned Vibes, which I love. I think that this was such a slept on palette, and I really enjoy having this in my collection. I just realized I have 4 Urban Decay palettes. I'm sorry, you guys. I also have the Urban Decay Naked Wild West, which I also really enjoy. I think this is a really nice palette. I wasn't as excited when this released, but having it in my collection and using it, I've really enjoyed this. So this will be staying, as well as my Naked Honey, which I love. I just created a full look with this the other day, and I loved the way that the look turned out. I'm a little bit mad at myself that I haven't used this palette that much this year, but keeping that, and also keeping my Urban Decay Born to Run, which is such a staple to have in my collection as well. Okay, let's move on to Pat McGrath. I have 2 6 pans. I have this holiday release. This was the, I think, Subliminal palette. I am going to keep this. I love this palette for pretty much all the shades except for the blue shade, which was a bit of a disappointment, but I still really enjoy this palette. I also really ended up loving this palette, which was this the Rose Decadence? Yes, the Rose Decadence palette. I really came to love this palette. This is kind of what turned me on to like more pinkish tones. And I've really enjoyed having this in my collection. And then I'll also obviously be keeping my 3 large Pat McGraths. So we have the number 3, I believe, which is so stinking beautiful. If it would focus, there we go. This one is the Divine Rose, the first one. This is not my favorite, but I also am not going to declutter this one. For a second there I was like, should I? No, I'm gonna keep this. And then also I have my favorite, which is the Bronze Seduction palette. Would never ever in a million years dream of getting rid of this. Next up we have my large Huda Beauty palettes. I am going to be decluttering the Desert Dusk palette. I just do not get inspired by this, and there's no point in me keeping this in my collection, but I will be keeping my Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde, which is another favorite palette in my collection. I think this is such a stunning palette. Love the color story. And then also the Naughty Nudes I do really enjoy, especially just for neutral, everyday, work appropriate, that type of thing. Love this. We'll be keeping this. Okay, let's start with my large Natasha Denona palettes. I'm going to obviously be keeping the gold palette. I freaking adore this palette. I'll save Circo Loco for last. I'm also keeping my Biba palette, Such a beautiful staple palette to have in your collection. Lila also keeping. Freaking love this palette. I think it's so beautiful. So that brings us to the Circo Loco palette, and I was going to keep this because this is new to my collection this year, but then I was like, why am I going to keep this when I don't feel like I'm going to use it at all? The only shade that I really will miss is the shade Snow Cone, but I just will not reach for this, and then there's no point in me keeping this palette in my collection. So I am actually going to be decluttering the Natasha Denona Circo Loco palette. Then moving on to my Natasha midi palettes, which I will be keeping all of my midis. I have the Love palette, the newest to the midi line, the Retro palette. I have the Zendo palette. And then I also have the Sunrise palette. Again, I will be keeping all of the midi palettes. Love them all so much. Here is one more Colourpop palette that got missed is the Wild Child, which I love and will be keeping. Both of my Persona palettes I will be keeping. I have the number 2 as well as the original, which is one of my absolute favorite palettes in my collection. Definitely keeping both of these. I also missed another ABH palette along the way. I missed my Carly palette, which I will be keeping. Yes, keeping for now. You guys know I'm going to 100% be keeping my Artist Couture Supreme Nudes as well as the Supreme Bronze. I freaking love these palettes. They're incredible. Would never think to declutter these. Also definitely will not be decluttering any of my Odin's Eye palettes. I have the Soulmane palette, which is stunning. I also have the Elva palette, which looks like this. So beautiful. And then I have the Norns palette, which is another just new favorite in my collection. This is going to be so beautiful all winter long. Definitely keeping all 3 of these. Also keeping all of my larger Nabla palettes. I have the Dreamy 2. I have the Dreamy. I have the Secret. As well as the infamous Nabla Side by Side palette. Colored Rain Queen of Hearts I will definitely be keeping. Not ready to part with this. And then I have these 4 from Glam Light, and I actually think I'm going to declutter my Glam Light Donut palette just because I don't see myself getting a ton of use out of this color story. I still think the quality is really good, and I do really like the shimmers, but I don't see myself reaching for this one that much. I am going to be keeping the Cherry Pie palette, or just the Pie palette. Looks like this. As well as the Ice Cream palette, which I freaking love. So beautiful. And then also the Cake palette I will be keeping. This is another really great palette, really beautiful rainbow palette. So definitely keeping this. Okay, laid out in front of me are all of the palettes that I will be decluttering, which is 26 palettes. So oh wait, I forgot we're decluttering the donut palette, so that's 27. Did look through everything again to try and see if there was anything else that I was willing to declutter. And again, I don't want to declutter anything just for the sake of decluttering. I was thinking about the BH palette, but I'm not going to do that. But I am going to declutter my ABH Soft Glam palette. I am ready to get rid of this just because I do have the Nabla Side by Side palette, and I am ready to part with this. But aside from that, there was really nothing else that I felt comfortable decluttering at this point in time. Although, no, I think this is going to be it. This is going to be it. So there are all of the palettes that we will be decluttering. There are 28 palettes that we'll be getting rid of. I will post on the screen how many palettes we started with, so you guys kind of have a better idea of where we started and where we ended and where my collection is at now. I do feel good about getting rid of some of these palettes. I still feel like I have so many, but you know, maybe there'll be another declutter on the horizon. We shall see. We'll see how my palettes on their last hurrah go, see if I get rid of any more palettes based on that series. But I hope that you guys enjoyed. Leave me comments down below. Have you recently decluttered any palettes? Are there palettes you feel like I should get rid of that I didn't declutter today? I would love to hear from you. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye!